Madam Speaker, I'll be splitting my time with the member from Timmins James Bay. The climate emergency is the existential threat of our time. And yet when people are worried about the cost of living, about putting food on the table, about paying rent, it is hard to focus on the climate emergency. And at the same time, while Canadians are struggling with the high cost of gas, of the rising cost of living, big oil companies are making record profits. While Canadians pay $2 at the pump, Imperial Oil made their highest profit in 30 years, and Suncor more than tripled their profits, raking in almost $3 billion in the first quarter. But despite these record profits, and despite promising to end fossil fuel subsidies, the Liberals continue to hand over billions of public dollars to profitable oil and gas companies, the very same companies that are fueling the climate crisis. Canadians shouldn't be paying big oil to pollute. As parliamentarians, it is our job to address these pressing crises, these interconnected issues, to hold them, to protect our communities, and to take action. That's why New Democrats are calling on the government to stop using Canadians' taxpayer money to subsidize and finance the oil and gas sector, including through crown corporations such as Export Development Canada and the $2.6 billion carbon capture tax credit, and to reinvest those savings in renewable energy and to provide help for Canadians who are struggling with the high cost of living. Last year alone, the Liberals gave out $8.6 billion in subsidies and public financing to the fossil fuel sector, over $5 billion through Export Development Canada. Canada gives more public financing to the fossil fuel industry than any other G20 country, handing out 14 times more financing to oil and gas than to renewable energy between 2018 and 2020. The Liberals have promised to accelerate Canada's G20 commitment to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies by the end of 2023. But recent testimony from Finance and Environment Canada officials at the Environment Committee showed that the government has made very little progress on this commitment and still doesn't even have a clear definition of what an inefficient fossil fuel subsidy is, something for which the Environment Commissioner has consistently criticized this government. Canada has also made a commitment at COP26 in November to phase out public financing of the fossil fuel sector internationally. The mandate letters for the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and the Minister of Natural Resources include instructions to develop a plan to phase out public financing of the fossil fuel sector, including by federal crown corporations. But despite this being included in those mandate letters, there has been no progress on this commitment. In the US, President Biden has already introduced policies limiting public financing to fossil fuels within a month of COP26. And earlier this month, a group of 112 environmental organizations, including Environmental Defense, Climate Action Network, Equiterre, sent a letter to Cabinet outlining their concerns that the government's commitment on fossil fuel subsidies aren't enough to meet Canada's climate targets. Not only that, but these environmental organizations are also worried about the new subsidies and public financing being made available to carbon capture and fossil-based hydrogen. They're urging the government to eliminate all subsidies, public financing, and financial support to the oil and gas sector by the end of this year. The Liberals say the right things, but then they fail to act. They promised to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, but they continue to increase them. It's clear that the Liberals are going in the wrong direction with their new $2.6 billion carbon capture tax credit, the largest so-called climate item in the budget. In comparison, the one fossil fuel subsidy they eliminated in the budget is worth only $9 million over 5 years. $9 million versus $2.6 billion. The tax credit is a massive new subsidy for carbon capture technology that is not proven at scale and is used as an excuse by oil and gas companies to justify increased production and in turn higher emissions. Reducing the carbon intensity of oil production only addresses a fraction of the life cycle emissions of a barrel of oil. 80% of emissions occur when the oil is burned. So using carbon capture for oil and gas production, even in the best case scenario, which currently doesn't exist, only prevents 3 to 15% of greenhouse gas emissions, life cycle emissions, from entering the atmosphere. The Liberals' emissions reduction plan released this spring relies heavily on carbon capture, but carbon capture projects have not been successfully deployed at the scale needed to make them part of a viable pathway to reach net zero emissions by 2050. More than 80% of the carbon capture projects attempted in the US have ended in failure. And Shell's Quest carbon capture facility near Edmonton is emitting more greenhouse gases than it captures, the equivalent of putting over 1 million cars on the road. The IPCC has warned against relying too heavily on unproven technologies like carbon capture to meet our climate goals. The Liberals will claim that the IPCC says we need carbon capture. But what the IPCC actually says is that while some carbon removal will be needed to reach net zero by 2050, carbon capture is one of the least effective and most expensive options. Experts have also told the Environment Committee that carbon capture should be reserved as an option as a last resort for heavy industry sectors that are hard to decarbonize, like concrete and steel. But Canada and other countries pushed for carbon removal to have an increased importance in the IPCC's last report to justify their own flawed approach. It's very clear that this Liberal government has been listening to oil and gas lobbyists instead of the science. They ignored the advice of over 400 experts who urged them not to go ahead with the carbon capture tax credit, refusing to even meet with them. But they were happy to meet with Big Oil, who have lobbied this Liberal government, meeting over 6,800 times. And now, despite record profits, Big Oil are asking for even more government subsidies. Amazingly, at the very same time that Cenovus was announcing $1.6 billion in profits and tripling their dividends to shareholders, their CEO said that carbon capture tax credit, it wasn't enough. They wanted even more public dollars. Big Oil couldn't make it any more clear that they don't want to spend a dime of their own money. These profitable oil and gas companies that are fueling the climate crisis can afford to clean up their own pollution. Canadians should not be paying the price. Not only do we need to stop handing out billions of public dollars to profitable oil and gas companies, we need to start investing those billions in the real climate solutions we know are so desperately needed to secure a livable planet. Continued subsidies to the oil and gas sector delay climate action and divert precious resources from the investments in a renewable energy transition and support for the workers and communities that will be affected. Last month, the IPCC made it clear that the world urgently needs to move away from fossil fuels and make significant investments in renewable energy if we have any hope of keeping global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees and avoiding the most catastrophic consequences of the climate crisis. Renewable energy technology is ready, it's available, and the costs have decreased significantly. But this government is not making the needed investments. The IPCC said that countries like Canada need to boost investments in renewable energy by at least a factor of 3 to meet our climate goals. Instead, this government continues to throw billions at the big companies, the big oil and gas companies who are fueling the crisis. Investing in renewable energy, strengthening grids, electrifying infrastructure, and energy efficiency retrofits will not only help fight the climate crisis, but they also create good long-term jobs for Canadians and communities across the country. And it will help make life more affordable. The Liberals need to stop the public financing of big oil companies now, not just more empty promises, but real action. If they're really serious about ending subsidies, ending public financing, they can start by eliminating tax credits for oil and gas exploration and development right away, which could bring in almost $10 billion over the next 4 years. That's $10 billion in savings that can be reinvested in renewable energy and in help for Canadians struggling with the high cost of living. Canadians are worried. They're worried about the future for their family, for future generations. They're worried about how they're going to make ends meet today. we have an opportunity to tackle some of the biggest issues of our time in a way that supports those who are struggling, in a way that safeguards our climate for generations to come. I